The year was 1963, and somewhere deep in the Arizona desert, a young soldier named Marcus Webb was about to make a decision that would haunt the United States military for decades. This wasn't supposed to be his story to tell. In fact, for over 40 years, it wasn't anyone's story to tell. The files were sealed, the witnesses were scattered, and the official record simply stated that nothing unusual happened on the night of November 14th. But Marcus Webb knew different, and what he did that night would save 17 lives while breaking every rule in the military handbook. Marcus Webb wasn't the kind of soldier who stood out in a crowd. At 22 years old, he had joined the Army right out of high school in rural Oklahoma, following in his father's footsteps like so many young men did back then. He was average height, kept his uniform pressed, and never caused trouble. His superiors described him as reliable but unremarkable. The kind of guy who did his job, kept his head down, and would probably serve his time without anyone remembering his name. That's exactly how Marcus liked it. He had seen what happened to soldiers who drew attention to themselves, and it was never good. By November of '63, Marcus had been stationed at Fort Huachuca in Arizona for 8 months. The base was used primarily for communications training, and Marcus worked the night shift monitoring radio frequencies. It was monotonous work, sitting in a small room filled with equipment that hummed and clicked through the darkness, listening to static and routine transmissions. Most nights, nothing happened. Soldiers would check in from various posts around the base, weather reports would come through, and Marcus would log everything in his notebook with the same careful handwriting his third-grade teacher had praised him for years ago. But Fort Huachuca held secrets that most soldiers never knew about. Deep in the mountain ranges surrounding the base, the military conducted experiments that didn't appear in any public record. Marcus had heard rumors, of course. Everyone had. Late-night conversations in the mess hall would sometimes drift towards stories about strange lights in the desert, about classified projects that involved technology nobody could explain, about entire units that would disappear for weeks and return different somehow. Marcus always dismissed these stories as the kind of tales soldiers told to break up the boredom. He figured if something important was happening, someone would tell him. That was his mistake, assuming that the truth was something he'd be trusted with. The night of November 14th started like any other. Marcus reported for duty at 2200 hours, relieving Sergeant Collins, who looked exhausted and eager to get to bed. The radio room was cold despite the desert heat outside. The military kept it that way to protect the equipment. Marcus poured himself coffee from the thermos he'd brought, settled into his chair, and began his routine checks. Everything was functioning normally. The base was quiet. Outside, the desert stretched endlessly under a clear sky filled with more stars than Marcus had ever seen back in Oklahoma. Around midnight, Marcus received a standard transmission from Patrol Unit 7, a group of 4 soldiers doing perimeter checks in the southern sector. They reported everything normal and signed off. Marcus logged it and went back to his coffee. 30 minutes later, Patrol Unit 7 checked in again. This wasn't unusual. Sometimes patrols would report in early if they were ahead of schedule, but something in the radio operator's voice made Marcus pause. There was a tension there, a slight tremor that didn't match the casual words being spoken. Marcus asked if everything was all right. The operator confirmed it was and signed off quickly. Too quickly. Marcus sat back in his chair and stared at the radio. His training told him to log the transmission and move on. His instinct told him something was wrong. He had learned to trust his instincts growing up in Oklahoma, where reading situations correctly could mean the difference between walking away from a fight or ending up in the hospital. He picked up the microphone and tried to raise Patrol Unit 7 again. No response. He waited 5 minutes and tried again. Still nothing. That's when Marcus made his first decision to break protocol. He switched to a restricted frequency that he wasn't supposed to access without direct authorization and scanned for any unusual activity. What he heard made his blood run cold. There were voices on channels that should have been empty, distress signals that weren't being logged through official channels, and underneath it all, a strange interference pattern that Marcus had never encountered in his 8 months of training. Something was happening out in that desert, and whatever it was, the army wasn't talking about it through normal communication lines. Marcus knew he had 2 choices. He could follow procedure, log what he'd heard, and report it to his commanding officer in the morning. Or he could do something that could end his military career before it really started. Marcus chose the latter. He grabbed his jacket and headed for the motor pool, signing out a jeep with a requisition form that he knew wouldn't hold up to scrutiny if anyone bothered to check. But it was past midnight, and the corporal on duty barely glanced at the paperwork before tossing Marcus the keys. Within 10 minutes, Marcus was driving south into the desert, following the route the Patrol Unit 7 should have taken. The dirt road was barely visible in the darkness, and Marcus drove without headlights, using the moonlight to navigate. He had no real plan, no backup, and no authorization for what he was doing. All he had was the growing certainty that something was terribly wrong. The desert at night is a different world. During the day, it's harsh and unforgiving, but at night, it transforms into something almost alien. Shadows stretch and twist in ways that play tricks on your eyes. Sounds carry for miles but seem to come from nowhere. Marcus had grown comfortable with the desert over his months at Fort Huachuca, but tonight it felt different, hostile. As he drove deeper into the restricted zone, he began to see why. There were vehicle tracks that veered off the main patrol route, heading west toward an area that was strictly off-limits, even to most military personnel. Marcus knew about this zone. Everyone did. It was marked with signs warning of live fire exercises and unexploded ordnance, but there hadn't been any exercises scheduled for tonight. Marcus had checked the log before his shift started. He followed the tracks for another 20 minutes until he saw something that made him stop the jeep. In the distance, there were lights, not the steady glow of vehicle headlights or the scattered pinpoints of a camp. These were intense, bright beams that seemed to be searching the ground in systematic patterns, and they were coming from the sky. Marcus killed the jeep's engine and sat in silence, watching. The lights moved with purpose, sweeping across the desert floor in grid patterns. They were too low to be from an aircraft, at least any aircraft that Marcus knew about. And there was no sound of engines, no rotor wash from helicopters, just the lights, silent and methodical. Marcus grabbed the binoculars from the jeep's emergency kit and focused on the area beneath the lights. What he saw defied everything he thought he knew. There were vehicles down there, military trucks arranged in a circle, and in the center of that circle, there was something else, something large and metallic that reflected the searching lights in ways that hurt to look at directly. Marcus couldn't make out the shape clearly, but it was obviously not standard military equipment. Around the vehicles, he could see figures moving, and they appeared to be working on something, though Marcus couldn't tell what. Then he saw Patrol Unit 7. Their jeep was parked at the edge of the circle, and Marcus could make out 4 figures sitting inside it. They weren't moving, they weren't getting out to investigate or participating in whatever was happening. They were just sitting there, and even from this distance, Marcus could sense something was wrong with them. He made a decision. He started the jeep and drove toward the lights, not caring anymore about stealth or protocol. Whatever was happening down there, Patrol Unit 7 needed help. As Marcus got closer, he could see more details. The metallic object in the center of the circle was roughly triangular, about 30 feet on each side, and it seemed to hover about 3 feet off the ground. The searching lights were coming from it, not from any external source. The figures around the vehicles were soldiers, but they moved in strange, synchronized patterns that didn't match normal military behavior. and Patrol Unit 7's jeep was surrounded by 3 men in different uniforms, uniforms that Marcus didn't recognize. They appeared to be standing guard, preventing anyone from leaving. Marcus stopped his jeep about 50 yards away and grabbed the M14 rifle from the back seat. He chambered around and approached on foot, using the sparse desert vegetation for cover. As he got closer, he could hear voices. They were calm, professional, discussing something in technical terms that Marcus didn't understand. Words like containment and exposure and protocol breach. One voice stood out, an older man who seemed to be in charge. He was telling the others to prepare the subjects for transport. That's when Marcus realized with cold certainty that the subjects he was talking about were the soldiers from Patrol Unit 7. Marcus had never been the hero type. Back in Oklahoma, he'd avoided fights, kept his opinions to himself, and generally tried to stay out of trouble. But standing there in the Arizona desert, listening to strangers talk about his fellow soldiers like they were cargo to be shipped somewhere, something inside him shifted. These weren't enemy combatants. These were American soldiers on American soil, and whatever was happening here wasn't right. Marcus stepped out from behind the creosote bush he'd been using for cover and raised his rifle. He shouted for everyone to freeze and identify themselves. The reaction was immediate and not what he expected. The soldiers around the vehicles didn't reach for weapons. They didn't panic or scatter. They simply stopped what they were doing and turned to look at him with expressions of mild annoyance, like he was an inconvenient interruption to their work. The older man, who Marcus could now see wore a civilian suit under a military jacket, sighed and walked toward him with his hands visible but not raised. He told Marcus to lower his weapon and return to base. He said this situation was classified and that Marcus didn't have the clearance to be here. He spoke with the kind of casual authority that expected to be obeyed without question. Marcus didn't lower his rifle. He demanded to know what was happening to Patrol Unit 7 and why they weren't responding. The older man paused, seeming to calculate how much he needed to say. Finally, he explained that there had been an incident. An experimental aircraft had malfunctioned and crashed in this sector. Patrol Unit 7 had encountered it before the recovery team arrived and had been exposed to certain materials. Nothing dangerous, he assured Marcus, but they needed to be examined and debriefed before they could return to normal duty. The story sounded reasonable, almost plausible, except for one detail. Marcus had been monitoring all radio frequencies for his entire shift. There had been no crash reported, no emergency protocols initiated, no search and rescue operations launched. Nothing. Marcus called out to Patrol Unit 7, trying to get a response from them directly. At first, there was nothing. Then, slowly, one of the soldiers turned his head toward Marcus. Even in the dim light, Marcus could see something was wrong with his eyes. They were unfocused, distant, like he was looking at something far away instead of the desert in front of him. The soldier opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. Just a soft sound that might have been a plea for help or might have been nothing at all. That was enough for Marcus. He told the older man that he was taking Patrol Unit 7 back to base and that they could sort out the rest through proper channels. The older man's expression hardened. He told Marcus that wasn't going to happen. He explained in a tone that had lost all pretense of friendliness that Marcus had stumbled into a matter of national security. The soldiers in Patrol Unit 7 had seen things they weren't supposed to see. They had information in their heads that could compromise projects that were vital to America's defense. They needed to be properly handled, and Marcus needed to leave immediately and forget everything he'd witnessed. If he didn't, there would be consequences. Not threats, the man clarified. Just consequences. The military took care of its own, but it also protected its secrets. Marcus needed to decide which side of that equation he wanted to be on. For a moment, Marcus almost backed down. The rational part of his brain was screaming at him to do exactly what the man said. Walk away, forget this night, go back to his quiet life monitoring radio frequencies. But then he looked at Patrol Unit 7 again, at those 4 young men sitting motionless in their jeep, and he thought about his father. His dad had served in World War II and had come home with stories about soldiers who'd been left behind, about men who'd made sacrifices that nobody ever acknowledged. His father had taught Marcus that the uniform meant something. It meant you looked out for the people beside you no matter what. Marcus lowered his rifle, but not in surrender. He slung it over his shoulder and walked toward Patrol Unit 7's jeep, ignoring the older man's increasingly urgent demands to stop. Before we continue with what happened next, if you're finding this story as incredible as I did when I first uncovered it, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. These forgotten stories need to be told, and your subscription helps make sure they reach the people who need to hear them. Now back to that desert night in 1963. Marcus reached Patrol Unit 7's jeep and opened the driver's side door. The soldier behind the wheel was a kid named Danny Peterson from Wisconsin. Marcus had shared KP duty with him a few times. Danny was always talking about his girlfriend back home and how he was going to marry her as soon as his service was up. Now, Danny just stared straight ahead, his hands still on the steering wheel, his foot still on the brake. Marcus put his hand on Danny's shoulder and gave him a gentle shake. Danny blinked, slowly, like someone waking from a deep sleep. He turned to look at Marcus, and for just a moment, there was recognition in his eyes. "Help us," Danny whispered. "They put something in our heads." That's when the situation escalated. The men in the unfamiliar uniforms moved to intercept Marcus, and the older man was shouting orders. But Marcus had already made his decision. He pulled Danny out of the driver's seat and pushed him toward his own jeep. Then he went for the other 3 soldiers, dragging them out one by one. They were conscious but docile, moving like sleepwalkers. 2 of them were privates Marcus didn't know well, but the 4th was Corporal James Mitchell from Georgia, a career soldier who'd been talking about going to officer training school. Mitchell was the heaviest, and Marcus struggled to get him moving, all while the recovery team closed in. The older man ordered his people to stop Marcus, but there seemed to be some confusion about how far they were authorized to go. They had weapons, but weren't drawing them. They had authority, but seemed unsure how to use it against another American soldier who wasn't technically doing anything illegal except refusing orders from someone who might not have the right to give those orders. This hesitation gave Marcus the window he needed. He got all 4 members of Patrol Unit 7 into his jeep, piling them in however they'd fit. Then he climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and floored the accelerator. The jeep lurched forward, kicking up a cloud of dust that temporarily obscured everything behind them. Marcus heard shouting, heard engines starting, but he didn't look back. He focused on driving, navigating the rough desert terrain as fast as he dared, with 4 disoriented soldiers bouncing around in the vehicle with him. Danny Peterson had ended up in the passenger seat, and he was starting to come around more fully. He kept asking Marcus what had happened, where they were, why he couldn't remember the last few hours. Marcus told him to hold on, and that they'd figure it out once they got back to base. But Marcus wasn't heading back to Fort Huachuca. He'd realized, during those frantic moments of loading the soldiers, that returning to base would be a mistake. Whoever those people were in the desert, they had resources and authority that Marcus didn't understand. If he drove back to Fort Huachuca, he'd be driving right into their hands. They'd separate him from Patrol Unit 7, confiscate his report, and make everything disappear, including, quite possibly, Marcus himself. So instead, he turned north, heading toward the small town of Sierra Vista that sat just outside the base's southern boundary. It was a gamble, but it was the only play Marcus could see. The drive took 40 minutes, and during that time, the 4 soldiers gradually became more alert. They started asking questions, trying to piece together what had happened. The last thing any of them remembered clearly was investigating what they thought was a downed aircraft. They'd seen lights, approached to render aid, and then everything became fragmented. images without context, sensations without meaning. Corporal Mitchell, who was the most coherent, said he remembered people in white coats asking him questions, not threatening questions, almost friendly. But every time he tried to answer, the words wouldn't come, like something was stopping him from speaking. Marcus pulled into Sierra Vista just after 3 in the morning. The town was dark and quiet, just a handful of streetlights illuminating empty roads. Marcus drove to the one place he thought might offer sanctuary, the Veterans of Foreign Wars Hall on the main street. His father had been a VFW member, and Marcus had grown up attending fish fries and Memorial Day ceremonies at halls, just like this one. He knew the VFW took care of its own, and he hoped that principle extended to soldiers in trouble. He parked the Jeep behind the building and helped the 4 soldiers out. They were all standing on their own now, though they still seemed confused and unsteady. Marcus found a payphone on the corner and made a call to a number his father had given him years ago. "Emergency use only," his dad had said. "If you're ever in real trouble and can't trust the chain of command, call this number." Marcus had written it in the back of his wallet and forgotten about it until tonight. The phone rang 6 times before someone answered. A man's voice, rough with sleep and suspicion. Marcus identified himself using the code phrase his father had taught him and explained as briefly as he could what had happened. There was a long silence on the other end. Then the voice told Marcus to stay where he was. Help was coming, but it might take a few hours. Marcus hung up and went back to check on the others. Dawn came slowly to Sierra Vista that morning, painting the desert sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Marcus and the members of Patrol Unit 7 waited in the alley behind the VFW hall, trying to stay out of sight. Corporal Mitchell had recovered enough to take charge, and he posted Danny Peterson as a lookout while the other 2 soldiers, Privates Hayes and Rodriguez, rested against the building's back wall. Marcus filled Mitchell in on everything he'd seen in the desert, and Mitchell listened with an expression that went from skeptical to grave. Mitchell revealed something that Marcus hadn't known. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened. 3 months earlier, another patrol had reported strange lights in the same sector. They'd been debriefed and sent on leave immediately afterward. When they returned to Fort Huachuca 2 weeks later, they didn't remember anything unusual about that night. They gave statements saying they'd seen some experimental aircraft testing, and that was all. Mitchell had thought it was odd at the time, but hadn't pursued it. Now he wondered what had really happened to those soldiers during their leave. The help Marcus had called for arrived just before 7 in the morning. It came in the form of 3 men in civilian clothes, driving an unmarked sedan. The man in charge introduced himself as Frank Sullivan, and he showed Marcus credentials identifying him as working for a congressional oversight committee. Sullivan looked like someone's grandfather, with white hair and wire-rimmed glasses, but his eyes were sharp and calculating. He examined each of the soldiers from Patrol Unit 7, asking them questions about what they remembered and what they felt. Then he turned to Marcus and asked him to repeat his story, stopping him frequently to clarify details. When Marcus finished, Sullivan made a decision. He told them they were all going to Washington, D.C., and they were leaving immediately. He said there were people in the capital who needed to hear this story, people who had the authority to do something about it. But they had to move fast. By now, the recovery team from the desert would have reported what happened, and there would be people looking for them. Sullivan had resources and connections, but they weren't unlimited. If they were going to expose what was happening at Fort Huachuca, they needed to do it before those people could silence them. The trip to Washington took 3 days. Sullivan drove them to Phoenix, where they boarded a private plane that flew them to Dallas. In Dallas, they switched to a commercial flight, traveling under false names that Sullivan provided. The entire time, Marcus felt like he was in a dream. Just days ago, he'd been a nobody monitoring radio frequencies in the desert. Now he was part of something that felt like a spy novel. Sullivan spent the travel time interviewing each of them extensively, taking notes in a leather-bound journal that never left his sight. He seemed particularly interested in what the soldiers could remember about the metallic object Marcus had described. In Washington, Sullivan took them to a hotel near Capitol Hill and told them to stay in their rooms. For 2 days, nothing happened. Marcus and the others watched television, ordered room service, and waited. Sullivan came and went at odd hours, but never explained what he was doing. On the 3rd day, he returned with news. A closed hearing had been scheduled with a select committee. They were going to testify, but under strict conditions. No recordings, no media, no public access. Just them, the committee, and whatever truth they could provide. Marcus asked what would happen after they testified. Sullivan admitted he didn't know. The hearing took place in a basement room of a government building that had no identifying markers. Marcus and the others were led through a series of corridors that all looked the same until they reached a room with a long table and 6 senators sitting behind it. Marcus recognized 2 of them from newspaper photos, but the others were unfamiliar. For 3 hours, they told their story. Marcus described what he'd seen in the desert. The members of Patrol Unit 7 described their fragmented memories. Sullivan provided context about other incidents that had been reported and suppressed. The senators listened without interrupting, taking notes and occasionally exchanging glances that Marcus couldn't interpret. When it was over, the committee chairman thanked them for their service and courage. He said their testimony would be reviewed and appropriate action would be taken. But he also made something clear. They were never to speak about this to anyone. Ever. Not to other soldiers, not to journalists, not to their families. What they'd witnessed was a matter of national security. And while the committee appreciated their honesty, the information they possessed was too sensitive to be made public. They would be reassigned to new posts far from Fort Huachuca, and they would be expected to complete their service without incident. If they complied, their military records would show nothing unusual. If they didn't, well, the chairman didn't need to spell out what would happen. Marcus was transferred to Fort Bragg in North Carolina the following week. The members of Patrol Unit 7 were scattered to different bases across the country. Marcus never saw any of them again. He completed his military service, received an honorable discharge, and returned to Oklahoma. He got a job at a hardware store, married a woman named Sarah, who never asked about his time in the army, and raised 2 children. He lived a quiet, ordinary life, and for years he tried to forget about that night in the Arizona desert. But forgetting proved impossible. Marcus would wake up sometimes in the middle of the night, remembering those lights in the sky and the metallic object hovering over the desert floor. He'd remember the look in Danny Peterson's eyes when he'd whispered, "Help us." He'd remember Frank Sullivan's warning in Washington that some secrets were too dangerous to tell, and he'd wonder if he'd done the right thing. He'd saved 4 soldiers that night, gotten them away from whatever was happening to them in that desert. But had he really saved them, or just delayed the inevitable? In 1978, 15 years after that night, Marcus received a letter with no return address. Inside was a newspaper clipping about Corporal James Mitchell, who had died in a car accident in Georgia. The circumstances were described as suspicious, but unresolved. 3 weeks later, another letter arrived. This one contained an obituary for Private Hayes, who'd apparently taken his own life. Over the next 2 years, Marcus received 3 more letters. Private Rodriguez had disappeared. Danny Peterson had died of what was officially called a heart condition, though he'd been only 35. And Frank Sullivan had suffered a stroke that left him unable to speak or write. Marcus understood the message. Everyone connected to that night was being erased one way or another. He realized his turn was coming, but instead of running or hiding, Marcus made a different choice. He started writing everything down. every detail he could remember about November 14th, 1963. He wrote about the lights, the metallic object, the recovery team, the soldiers whose minds had been tampered with. He wrote about Frank Sullivan and the congressional hearing and the warning to stay silent. He filled 3 notebooks with his memories, and then he made copies. He sent them to different people, journalists and researchers and veterans advocacy groups. He didn't know if anyone would believe him or if his story would make any difference, but he couldn't stay silent anymore. Nothing happened at first. Months passed, then a year. Marcus kept waiting for the consequences, but they never came. He began to think that maybe enough time had passed, that whoever wanted to keep that night secret had moved on or lost interest. He was wrong. In 1981, Marcus was contacted by a man claiming to be from the Defense Department. The man visited Marcus at his home in Oklahoma and told him that his writings had been noted. The government was prepared to offer Marcus a substantial sum of money in exchange for all copies of his notebooks and his agreement to cease making any further statements about his military service. The offer was generous, $50,000, which was real money back then. Marcus refused. The man from the Defense Department didn't threaten Marcus. He didn't try to intimidate him. He simply told Marcus that his choice was noted and left. Marcus expected retaliation, but again, nothing happened. It was almost worse than being threatened, not knowing what might come, waiting for consequences that never arrived. Marcus continued his normal life, but always with the sense that he was being watched, that somewhere in some file cabinet his name was marked. Years became decades. The Cold War ended. The world changed. And Marcus grew old, still carrying the weight of that night in the desert. In 2005, 42 years after the incident, Marcus was diagnosed with a condition that his doctor said would limit his remaining time significantly. He had maybe a year, they told him. 2, if he was lucky. Marcus decided he had nothing left to lose. He contacted every news organization he could find, trying to tell his story one more time. Most ignored him. A few sent junior reporters who listened politely and never followed up. But one journalist, a woman named Catherine Pierce, who specialized in military history, took him seriously. She spent 3 months investigating Marcus's claims, tracking down military records, interviewing people who'd served at Fort Huachuca in the 60s, and trying to verify the details of his story. What Catherine found was frustrating. Records from November 1963 were heavily redacted or missing entirely. The soldiers from Patrol Unit 7 had indeed been scattered to different bases shortly after that date, which was unusual. Frank Sullivan had existed, though his connection to any congressional oversight committee couldn't be confirmed. The VFW Hall in Sierra Vista had records of unusual activity on the night Marcus described, but nothing specific. It was all circumstantial, nothing that proved Marcus's story, but nothing that disproved it either. Catherine published an article about Marcus in a military history journal. It got some attention, sparked some discussion online, but ultimately faded away like so many other stories about government secrets and cover-ups. Marcus died in 2006, 7 months after his diagnosis. Catherine Pierce attended his funeral and was surprised to see it was crowded. Not with family, Marcus's children had moved away years ago, but with strangers, old men in veteran caps who stood in the back and didn't give their names, a woman who introduced herself only as a researcher and left before the service ended, and a young man who told Catherine he was the grandson of Danny Peterson from Wisconsin. His grandfather had never talked about his military service, the young man said, but near the end of his life, he'd told his daughter about a soldier named Marcus Webb who'd saved his life one night in Arizona. The young man had come to pay respects to a hero his grandfather had never forgotten. The story could end there, with Marcus's death and his unproven claims fading into history. But in 2017, something unexpected happened. A cache of declassified documents was released through a Freedom of Information Act request filed by a researcher studying Cold War military programs. Buried in thousands of pages of bureaucratic reports and technical specifications was a brief memo dated November 15, 1963. It referenced an incident at Fort Huachuca involving unauthorized access to a restricted area and the recovery of 4 military personnel who'd been exposed to classified materials. The memo recommended immediate reassignment of all personnel involved and noted that the situation had been contained thanks to the intervention of a night shift communications operator who'd been given official commendation but whose name was redacted. The memo was vague, careful not to reveal too much, but the details matched Marcus's story closely enough that Catherine Pierce, who'd continued researching the case over the years, immediately recognized the connection. She published a follow-up article that gained much more attention than her original piece. Other researchers began digging, and slowly, a picture emerged. During the early 1960s, the military had indeed been conducting experimental programs at various bases, including Fort Huachuca. These programs involved advanced technology, some of which had been recovered from sources the military wouldn't specify. There were multiple incidents of personnel being exposed to this technology, and standard protocol was to isolate them and administer what documents euphemistically called memory clarification treatments. What Marcus had witnessed that night wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a larger pattern of the military experimenting with technologies and techniques it didn't fully understand or control. The soldiers from Patrol Unit 7 had been scheduled for these treatments when Marcus intervened and disrupted the process. His actions had likely saved them from whatever long-term effects these treatments might have caused, though several of them had still died young under circumstances that seemed suspicious in retrospect. Marcus himself had been flagged as a security concern, but ultimately left alone, perhaps because silencing him would have drawn more attention than simply monitoring him. The full truth will probably never be known. Too many documents are still classified. Too many witnesses are dead. Too much time has passed. But what we do know is this. On November 14, 1963, a young soldier from Oklahoma made a choice to break protocol and do what he thought was right. He risked his career, his freedom, and possibly his life to help 4 fellow soldiers who needed saving. He spent decades being dismissed, ignored, and threatened because of that choice. And in the end, his story became one more forgotten piece of American military history that the government never wanted told. Marcus Webb never received the commendation that memo referenced. He never got recognition for his courage or vindication for his claims. He died believing that his story didn't matter, that speaking the truth had accomplished nothing. But he was wrong. His story mattered because it reminds us that heroism isn't always about following orders. Sometimes it's about knowing when to break them. It's about seeing something wrong and refusing to look away, even when looking away would be easier and safer. Marcus Webb was never going to be famous. He was never going to have medals pinned to his chest or statues erected in his honor. But he was a hero nonetheless, the kind of forgotten American hero that this country needs to remember. The military has never officially commented on the incident at Fort Huachuca. The families of Patrol Unit 7 received no explanations for their loved ones' early deaths. The technology that Marcus witnessed that night remains classified or has been destroyed. But the story endures, passed down through veteran communities and researched by people who believe that truth matters even when it's inconvenient. Marcus's notebooks still exist, stored in an archive at a university in Oklahoma. Catherine Pierce's articles can still be found online. And somewhere out there, maybe there are other soldiers who witnessed things they weren't supposed to see, who made difficult choices, who paid the price for doing what they believed was right. Their stories deserve to be told too. What happened in the Arizona desert that night in '63 was never fully explained. The Army can't explain it because explaining would mean admitting to programs and experiments that were never supposed to exist. But the men who were there know what happened. They know that one soldier chose to act when action wasn't safe or authorized. They know that sometimes the real enemy isn't the one you're trained to fight, but the system that expects your unquestioning obedience. And they know that Marcus Webb, an average soldier from Oklahoma who never wanted to be special, became someone worth remembering. Not because he was perfect or always right, but because when it mattered most, he did what needed to be done. That's the kind of hero America needs more of, the kind who doesn't wait for permission to do the right thing, the kind we should never forget.